You won't believe what a patch of wildflowers and a hidden secret deep in the ground turned one man's quest for tranquility into a fight that rocked an entire community. Press play to jump in. It began with a bed of wildflowers, nothing more than a peaceful corner of beauty. But in an area governed by strict rules and silent competitions, even something as simple as that can spark a battle no one anticipates. Have you ever wanted to know how far a person will go to keep the life they've created? And what happens when the power they possess runs deeper than anyone can imagine? Tonight, you'll learn about one man, one secret valve, and the day a quiet neighborhood discovered what real resilience is all about. They destroyed my house because my flower garden did not fit their vision of modern design. So I happened to fix one old valve, and all hell started breaking loose. The HOA president thought she had absolute power, with her dubious permits and her bulldozers. What she never expected was that my property had a secret piece of history, and a power she couldn't even understand. What began as a minor citation blew into a battle that drew in the whole neighborhood, and nobody, not even her, could have been ready for what came next. Would you have stood your ground? Join me where you're watching from, because this story takes an unexpected turn. My name is Travis Murphy. 6 months ago, I spent my life savings purchasing 20 acres on the outskirts of Willowbrook Estates. I'd spent 15 years living in cold, concrete apartments, staring at weather reports. This was some place, with its softly sloping wooden veranda and pine siding that released the forest's fragrance. Something of the real. For the first time, I could feel a life I'd only dreamed. After years of analyzing weather patterns for the government, I was burnt out and yearned for something simple. This territory looked like the solution, a place where I could finally create something with my own two hands, rather than wasting my days staring at data on a monitor. I put every last cent I possessed toward building a little wood house. Nothing fancy, just cedar boards, a wraparound porch, and wide-opening windows to bring in fresh air rather than recirculated office air. The previous owner had been an old rancher whose family wanted to sell quickly after he passed away. The contrast between this peaceful refuge and the sterile government buildings where I'd spent my career was like stepping out of a black-and-white photograph into vibrant color. That Tuesday morning in late spring, I was on my knees in the garden, yanking weeds out from between the stems of the wildflowers. My hands were dirty but light. The work, after years of typing and dreaming behind the desk, felt honest and good. Bees wandered through the lavender blooms and pale sunlight filtered down through the oaks that shaded the porch. For the first time, I thought, perhaps I'd finally found home. The property had a little creek running through the back, and a couple of weedy flower beds I'd been quietly restoring. It provided the sort of tranquility I hadn't experienced since I was a child. I was wiping dirt from my hands when the gravel crunched in the driveway. A silver BMW moved up, and it seemed as misplaced on my property as an alien spaceship. Out came a woman in her late 30s, blonde hair neatly styled, a clipboard full of documents held tightly in one hand, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her high heels didn't sink into the ground, as though she didn't have a place on any patch of ground where grass ran wild. She approached my garden with the confident stride of someone who had never questioned her right to tell others how they should live. "Good morning," she said, extending a manicured hand as she stepped off the flower bed. "I'm Maria Whitmore, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. We need to talk about your case." I rose, pushing my soiled hands through my jeans, already feeling this was no social greeting. The difference between us was stark. Me, with my genuine dirt from farming my land. Her, immaculate and perfect, as if she'd rolled straight off a lifestyle magazine. Maria's smile compressed as she rummaged through her papers, reading as if reciting lines memorized by heart. "Your wooden house is not up to standard. We need brick or stucco finishes. And this garden, too natural," she said, her tone dripping with contempt. looking at the wildflowers I had tended for months. How she regarded my lovingly cared-for beds, you'd have thought she was examining the scene of a crime. Ahead of her, I could glimpse the steel fence lining the entrance to the real HOA development. Rows of beige houses, side by side, each yard a perfect green carpet with not a dandelion to be seen. The whole thing seemed sterile, like nature had been sucked away for the sake of uniform perfection. "Ma'am, I purchased this land square and honest," I replied, my voice calm. "It's been privately held since the 1800s, before your HOA even existed. The historical records aren't disputed. My property never belonged to any homeowners association. I verified the deed thoroughly before I purchased it." Her demeanor changed in an instant, from gracious pretense to icy authority. It was like seeing someone switch on a switch. "Mr. Murphy, when we extended our community borders last year, your property came into our jurisdiction. Within 30 days, you need to bring your house up to code, or else you'll be hit with mounting fines and possible litigation." She drew out a fat folder of papers and pushed them toward me with the authoritative authority of someone who always gets her own way. "Your notice of infractions," Maria stated firmly, pushing the fat packet of paper into my hands, "plus our architectural standards and the list of approved contractors. I recommend you make some calls today." I took the papers but didn't even bother to open them. Instead, I stood and watched a pickup truck drive down the dirt road at the back of my land. The driver, a man in his middle age wearing work clothes, raised a hand in a wave. He was the owner of the sheep ranch along my back fence. I'd seen his herd grazing near the creek that ran off my land into his pasture many times, 1,500 woolly heads bobbing as they drank. The view of those serene animals, happily oblivious to their owner's wife and me causing commotion in between, seemed to be an affirmation of what truly counted. "Tell me something, Mrs. Whitmore," I told her, placing the packet on the railing without opening it. "What's your real interest in my 20 acres? Because this doesn't look like a neighborly visit over paint colors." For a moment, Maria's rehearsed smile faltered. In her eyes, I saw a flicker of calculation, the expression of someone totaling dollar signs and development opportunities. "Our neighborhood values are all about keeping property values up for everybody, Mr. Murphy. Your unorthodox decisions impact the whole community." With that, she turned to head away, her heels clicking on my porch steps in a countdown rhythm. At the foot of the stairs, she stopped. 30 days. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Her BMW vanished in a cloud of dust. As it disappeared, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. An ancient length of pipe sticking out from under my porch, capped with rusted metal. It was ancient looking, out of place, like it belonged to a different time entirely. The following morning, almost at dawn, hammering disrupted the peacefulness I had grown accustomed to. I dragged on my jeans and went outside. 2 working men in greasy clothes were pounding bright red stakes into the ground around my flower beds with machine-like accuracy. Surveying gear was poised beside them, taking measurements every inch with precision of individuals who were serious about business. The stakes gleamed in the early light, like tiny red flags planted on my land to mark a territory I'd never agreed to surrender. Maria wasn't wasting any time escalating her campaign. 3 days later, I discovered another notice stuck to my front door, this one for excessive grass height. I had left isolated patches of prairie grass on purpose, cultivating the native vegetation. The fine was $50, with a threat that it would double every week until I obeyed. 2 days after that, another citation came: non-conforming tree placement. My oak trees, it seemed, were casting shadows onto what Maria now insisted was a public easement. By the first week's end, I'd accumulated 4 infractions and $200 worth of fines just for living on my own property the way I wanted. After that, the harassment only increased. She hired contractors to cut down my trees, leaning over my fence to chop off perfectly healthy limbs. Inspectors would start appearing at random times, clipboards and tape measures in hand, saying they were inspecting for structural safety, but their tone made it obvious that they came to find any reason to fine me. Each day dawned with a new citation slipped into the door or taped to the mailbox. Code infractions for sitting furniture outside, for how I had hung my garden hose, even for what color I had painted my window trim. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. But the brilliance of Maria's tactic wasn't the constant harassment. It was how she framed herself as reasonable, while labeling me as troublemaking outsider. Every notice was phrased in terms of community harmony and preserving property values. She was carefully framing a story that would legitimize whatever came next. Those 20 acres I'd bought for peace and self-reliance were worth a fortune to anyone with the ambition to carve them into 50 identical house lots. Maria was methodically dismantling my ability to resist her plans. The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest tactic of all. I learned this the day I watched Elizabeth, my old neighbor in the corner house, care for her roses. She'd always been nice. To her, I'd even brought cookies when I moved in. I waved and said hello. For the first time, she stepped back. Her eyes flicked to the HOA office before she looked back at me, laden with regret. "I was told not to get mixed up in your case, Travis," she replied in a soft voice, trembling. "I hope you can see." Her shame spoke volumes. Maria wasn't just attacking me. She was infecting the entire community, making neighbors bystanders too afraid to be simple kind. A couple of days later, I was excavating around one of the red survey stakes, wondering what they were taking a measurement of, when my hand struck something underneath the dirt. I assumed it was another marker, but as I brushed away the dirt, words appeared, inscribed deep into metal. The letters were worn but indubitable, a message from the past. Under that inscription was the shape of a valve wheel. My heart started to race. I'd studied environmental systems for years and knew that water rights in Texas were not to be taken lightly, particularly 19th century ones. Gingerly, I removed the worn cover. A dark pipe fell 4 feet, stopping at a gigantic valve assembly. The metal was rusted but still strong, made to last by hands that knew survival depended on water. I could hear water moving far beneath, slow and measured as a heartbeat. Curiosity, and a growing feeling that I'd discovered something that could change the balance, propelled me into action. I put my hand on the wheel and turned it a quarter turn to the left. Then I went out to the creek at the back of my property. In a few minutes, the water slowed to a trickle. Then it ceased entirely. The creek bed, which had vibrated with life, was quiet now, glistening smooth rocks in the sunlight. My hands shaking, I returned to the valve and turned it around. The water flowed on as if nothing had occurred, but I knew that everything had changed. I covered the cover and leveled the ground with the heaviness of the weight that I now bore. I controlled the water supply which supplied this whole region, including the creek that supported Tom Whitmore's 1,500 sheep. Later that night, I drove to the county clerk's office and spent hours reading old records and water rights reports. What I discovered validated it. My 20 acres were the first control point for the Willow Creek watershed back in 1893. Not only were the water rights still valid, but legally safeguarded, grandfathered onto my deed, immune to any HOA jurisdiction. The next day, I was going through my mailbox when Tom Whitmore drove up in his pickup, his face etched with concern. "Morning, Travis," he called out. "Odd thing yesterday. My creek dried up for a few minutes, then returned. You notice anything unusual?" I didn't flinch. "Don't see that I did, Tom. Perhaps a beaver dam collapsed upstream." He nodded grudgingly, not convinced but ready to drop it. "Perhaps. Only makes me nervous. 1,500 sheep consume much water." Maria's next step came unexpectedly. At 6 in the morning, I was awoken by the rumble of heavy equipment outside my window. Huddled in my pajamas, I staggered to the front door. A bulldozer was running at the border of my flower garden, its blade already destroying the wildflowers I'd lovingly tended. Behind it was a dump truck with emergency demolition printed on its side, and 3 men in hard hats were starting to unload chainsaws and rakes. 20 feet away, clipboard in hand, stood Maria Whitmore. Her impeccably ironed business suit shone in the early morning light as she gazed on, pleased with herself. The expression in her eyes was unmistakable. This was not a matter of regulations anymore. This was personal. "What the devil are you doing?" I bellowed, making a dash for the yard in bare feet. One of the workers moved into my way, holding out a hand. "Sorry, sir. We have an order of work for emergency removal of dangerous vegetation and structures. You need to stand back." I faced Maria, my voice cracking with rage. "Emergency removal? These are flowers." "There is nothing dangerous about wildflowers," I stated, my voice shaking but defiant. Maria raised a thick stack of papers, each page stamped with official-seeming seals. "Actually, Mr. Murphy, we had a special HOA meeting last night due to complaints about potentially toxic plant life and loose buildings on your property. The board voted in a special meeting to approve the immediate remediation for safety in the community." I watched as the color drained from my face. "What meeting? I never received any notice of a meeting," I insisted. Maria's smile grew wider, good humor sparkling in her eyes at my perplexity. "Oh, but we did send notice. Look in your mailbox, it must be there." I dashed to the mailbox, ripped it open, and discovered only yesterday's everyday mail. No meeting notification, no agenda, nothing. "There's nothing here," I shouted back, but Maria just shrugged, her face a mask of pretentious indifference. "Well, maybe it was held up. Anyway, the meeting was held in order and the vote was taken. These men have their orders." She hesitated, regarding me with the cold, unfeeling curiosity of a scientist examining a specimen. "You ought to understand. There's no place for what you term individuality here," she continued, her tone relaxed in a manner that sent shivers down my spine. She wasn't merely killing my garden, she was attempting to kill my spirit. I whipped out my phone and started filming as the bulldozer blade ripped through my flower beds, rendering months of attention to dust in seconds. Wild flowers I'd planted by hand, native grasses that would draw birds and butterflies, a little vegetable garden where tomatoes and herbs had just begun to take off, all gone beneath grinding treads. The lavender I'd once wrapped in my shirt when leaving the Arizona research station was now crushed, mingled with diesel fumes and damp earth, transformed into mud that smelled like loss. I stood motionless, too stunned to shout. No fine or citation had ever hurt like this. This wasn't just damage to property. It was a calculated action meant to destroy me. Each plant that disappeared beneath the bulldozer was a chunk of my heart torn free. And Maria sat watching it all with the self-satisfied serenity of someone who knew she was going to come out on top. What she failed to see was that she had just made the single largest tactical error of her campaign. By rising to flat-out destruction, on false permits, she crossed a boundary that altered me. The man who had sought to compromise was gone, replaced by someone with nothing left to lose. I stood by as the bulldozer proceeded to knock down my little tool shed, allegedly an unpermitted structure. When the laborers started cutting down the young fruit trees I had planted, apple and pear saplings that wouldn't be ready for fruit for years, I couldn't remain quiet any further. "This is against the law! You can't wreck someone's property without giving them due notice," I screamed, my voice trembling. One of the laborers paused, frowning. "Sir, we're just doing our work orders. If you have an issue with the permits, you'll have to take that up with the HOA." Chainsaws wailed through the living wood, the smell of apple blossoms mixed with exhaust as the trees fell. I continued to record. The camera couldn't keep track of the sensation of diesel fumes scorching down my throat, or the shuddering of my hands as I watched all that I had created disappear in a matter of minutes. Once the work crew had finally departed, I stood amidst the ruins of my garden. Something within me changed. The anger was still present, but beneath it, lay a cold, unyielding determination even more deadly than any tantrum. I'd attempted to be reasonable. I'd hoped there was some sense to things. But Maria didn't care about rules or justice. She wanted me out, and she would destroy anything that got in her way. After lunch, I began calling every HOA board member I could find. What I discovered only confirmed my worst suspicions. Of the 12 members of the board, only 3 had shown up to any meeting the night before, and not one of them remembered voting to destroy my property. 2 were amazed to learn that there hadn't even been a meeting. I had evidence Maria had fabricated the meeting and forged the permits. But by then, my garden was destroyed. I sat on the porch, looking at bulldozer tracks cutting across what had been my haven that evening. Tom Whitmore's truck arrived, gravel spilling beneath his tires. He emerged slowly, his face pinched. "Jesus, Travis! What in the world?" I explained it all, the counterfeit documents, the shock demolition, and observed his face darken with each word. When I was done, he shook his head slowly. "This is my wife's doing, isn't it?" He already knew the answer. Well before dawn on the morning after my garden was destroyed, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be defensive anymore. It was time to let Maria know I had resources she couldn't bully out of existence. I wrote a formal letter, setting forth evidence of her illegal conduct and including one explicit warning. One more infraction, and I would exercise my 1893 water rights. I delivered it myself to the HOA board. The note was courteous and objective, but it had the heft of a man who had suddenly understood that he was carrying a loaded gun. To make sure nobody got the point, I also put up a wooden sign along the boundary of my property. Historical Water System Rights, established 1893. It was perfectly within the law, carefully recorded, and set where every car that drove by could see it. I drove wooden stakes along the underground valve system, delineating the borders of the most valuable 20 acres in the county. Evening traffic slowed while motorists read the sign. A man I didn't know grumbled, "If it's real, we're sitting on a water bomb." For the first time, people realized this wasn't about flower beds anymore. When I put the last letter in the assistant HOA president's mailbox, my hand shook, not out of fear of Maria, but because I realized there was no turning back. I had fired the opening shot. Maria retaliated quickly. Within hours, she appeared in the daylight, crowbar clutched in hand, her face contorted with anger. I sat on the porch, stony, documenting everything as the HOA president herself removed my legal property marker. "You can't install unauthorized signage," she yelled, struggling with the posts. "And you absolutely can't make absurd claims about being able to control water. This is harassment and intimidation." I raised my phone higher. "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore, all on that sign is well documented in the county records. Would you like me to call the sheriff to report you for vandalizing my property markers?" She tossed the crowbar to the ground and stormed to her car. "This isn't over, Murphy," she shouted. The threat dangled in the air. But finally, for the first time since this started, I felt like I was playing the stronger hand. Maria had just demonstrated to the whole neighborhood that she was willing to break the law when pushed, and I had it all taped. More to the point, she'd shown me that my assertion had shaken her to her very foundations. The following morning, she held an actual emergency HOA meeting, sending formal notices to each and every household. There was only one item on the agenda: discussion and vote on the Travis Murphy issue and his threats to community access to water. She was attempting to re-grasp the reins, but the community already knew she'd lost them. What Maria didn't know was that her own husband would be attending that meeting, and Tom Whitmore had already started asking questions she couldn't so readily answer. I spent the day rehearsing my presentation, gathering every scrap of paperwork, historic water rights, maps of the Willow Creek watershed, photos of the devastation Maria had wrought. And one last thing, a miniature portable pump I could use from my phone, prepared to show her precisely how the underground system functioned. If Maria desired a public confrontation, I was prepared to provide her with one she wouldn't soon forget. By 7 p.m., the community center was crowded. As I pulled in, I could already see that the parking lot was more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Word had gotten around. Tonight, the immovable object of Maria's power was going to clash with the unstoppable force of my legal water rights. I entered, preceded by my papers and the pump. All eyes tracked as I sat down toward the front. Maria was already at the podium, fidgeting with papers and sweeping the audience with a brittle, nervous smile. This was her territory, amongst her followers, under signs of community pride. But as she glanced my way, she knew she was about to face a fight she hadn't planned for. For the first time since I'd met her, Maria's posture betrayed uncertainty. The confident woman who had ordered my garden destroyed was beginning to realize she might have pushed too far, too fast, against someone with more resources than she'd ever imagined. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maria began, her voice steady but her eyes flickering, "we're here tonight because one of our neighbors has made threats against our community's water supply." She launched into a carefully rehearsed speech about property values and community standards, painting me as an outsider trying to extort the neighborhood with outlandish claims about historical water rights. As she spoke, I caught a glance of Tom Whitmore in the third row. His face became increasingly agitated with each charge his wife levied against me. By the time Maria finished and opened the discussion to everyone, I rose to my feet with my materials in hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," I started, heading to the front of the room. "I am here to make one thing clear. I did not threaten. I told the board of my legal entitlements, recorded and enforceable." I placed my portable pump on the table and unrolled the yellowed paper maps. The ink had faded, but it drew a distinct line. The control station of the whole water system was right under my front porch. The room was quiet. I described calmly and without drama how water rights in Texas functioned. I told her how my rights had been grandfathered into my deed over 100 years ago. Then I took out my phone and played the video I'd recorded of Maria destroying my property marker. "This," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking, "is what I call harassment." And then I wired the pump up to my phone so all could get live reads. This machine illustrates precisely how the system works. I pushed a button. 3 minutes passed and the gauge indicated an instantaneous decline in water pressure. Nobody said anything. A woman across the room got up, her voice constricted with concern. "If he gets control of our water, what becomes of the HOA if we push him too hard?" An old man in the back shouted, "And who authorized the HOA to grow without consulting the residents?" The atmosphere changed in a heartbeat. What started as a normal HOA meeting now had the feel of an impromptu trial. Neighbors were querying things Maria hadn't anticipated answering. And then Tom Whitmore stood up slowly from his chair, his skin white and his voice trembling. "Maria, what in the devil's name have you done?" Everyone's eyes were on him as he looked at his wife standing at the podium. "You said this was all about property values and neighborhood standards," he exclaimed, his voice increasing in strength. "But you never mentioned anything about water rights or endangering people's businesses." Maria's carefully composed expression cracked under the weight of her husband's public confrontation. "Tom, sit down," she snapped. "This is HOA business." But Tom's patience had reached its end. "HOA business?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the walls. "You're jeopardizing the water supply for my 1,500 sheep. That creek feeds my entire operation." His words landed with the force of a hammer. The dawning understanding that the HOA president's own spouse was now a casualty of her cause caused a visible shiver to run through the audience. Neighborhoods glanced at one another, murmuring. Maria struggled to get her bearings, her hands clenched around the microphone so hard that her knuckles turned white. Her crisp presentation fell apart in pieces. This is exactly what I mean about threats and intimidation, she yelled, her voice carrying above the hum of the crowd. He's attempting to take our whole community hostage with some fabricated historical claim. But her argument did not land. My phone's pump readouts left no question. This was no bluff. Tom rose again, voice commanding with the weight of one who had constructed a life from the earth. You tore up his garden, Maria. You drove bulldozers onto his property under fraudulent permits. And now you're shocked he's pushing back? He stood up to address the room, his tone burred. My wife lied to you, just as she lied to me. This is not about community standards. This is about her attempting to annex the HOA onto his property, and she will kill anyone who stands in her way. A stunned silence ensued. Maria froze. Everyone watched as her image as a leader dissolved before their eyes. I gathered my materials, feeling a deep, steady calm. I don't want to harm anyone's water supply, I explained to the room, my tone firm and soft. I just want to be left alone, to live in peace on my land. But as long as the harassment continues, I'll do whatever is necessary to defend myself, including exercising my legal water rights. I turned to exit, and the room was filled with hushed conversations. Neighbors flocked around Maria, demanding explanations she could no longer give. The power dynamic had changed. Everyone realized it. Tom had spoken out against her process of public shaming, and the whole neighborhood comprehended that their peaceful existence relied on keeping on the good side of the man their HOA president had made an enemy of. Maria's reaction to public shaming was inevitable. She doubled down. 3 days after that, I got a new batch of notice violations, this time for allegedly violating community noise codes and safety standards by testing the pump system. She was clutching at straws, her power visibly undermined, and everyone knew it. The last straw occurred when she arranged a so-called community safety inspection of my property. It came with a county inspector who seemed confused, obviously not knowing what he was there to inspect. They wandered around for an hour, taking measurements and snapping pictures of anything they could. When I requested to see their inspection warrant, the county official shifted in his boots. Sir, I don't actually have one. Mrs. Whitmore said this was a routine compliance check. Politely but firmly, I requested that they depart. Maria refused. So I called the sheriff myself. That evening, I sat by myself on my porch, alone with my thoughts. It was apparent Maria wouldn't relent. She would never settle for a decent compromise. She was prepared to risk her husband's job, her neighbor's well-being, and her own standing just to drive me out. And that left me with no other option but to act. I waited until dark. I slipped out, lifted the iron cover, and felt the cool, damp air come up from the ancient shaft. I heard water roaring underneath, a single turn of the valve, and water ceased to flow. The silence was complete, like the instant after lightning, before thunder comes. I emerged, restored the cover, and knew that in a few hours the effects would spread through this town like shock waves after an earthquake. The next morning was the HOA monthly meeting, where Maria was anticipating a routine review of landscaping requirements and architectural permits. But I had other ideas. At precisely 10 o'clock a.m., as Maria opened the meeting, I texted Tom 3 words: check your creek. 3 minutes later, Maria's phone started ringing, loud, persistent, impossible to ignore. Tom's panicked voice came through the speaker. The water's gone, Maria. The entire damn creek is dry, and 1,500 sheep are already under stress. His breathing was raw, his words spilling over one another in panic. Whatever you've done to that man, you'd better correct it right this minute or I lose everything. Maria struggled with her phone, attempting to turn the volume down, but too late. Everybody in that room had heard the call. The war for water was no longer abstract. It existed. I crept softly into the rear of the community center, sitting down as Tom's voice echoed through the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, I stated smoothly, I'm sure that we can all see what's going on here. I control your water source. Mrs. Whitmore has been pestering me illegally for months, and now her husband's livestock is suffering the consequences of her mistakes." The silence was broken only by Tom's gasping, ragged breathing over the phone and Maria's shallow, ragged gasps as she understood just how utterly she'd lost control. Someone in the audience finally spoke. "Is this for real?" a man yelled, his voice full of incredulity. "Did you really take on our entire water system over a garden?" Maria stepped back from the podium, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for an open door. The faces that stared back at her were one of shock, anger, and betrayal. Neighbors who were only now comprehending that their elected official had led them all into a war that put at risk their most fundamental needs. Maria's face moved through a sequence of emotions: anger, panic, desperation, and then something close to defeat. Her skin was as white as paper. Her eyelids trembled. Her lipstick was smudged, her hair disarranged. Nothing was left of that assertive HOA president she'd once been. She hung up on her husband and slowly lifted her eyes to meet mine. What do you want?" she whispered. I stood tall, surveying the 50 neighbors who had seen it all, who had witnessed this conflict escalate from a property dispute into what amounted to a siege. "I want my garden restored," I stated calmly. "I want you to step down as HOA president. I want a public apology for the illegal destruction of my property, and I want full reimbursement for the damages you've inflicted." The silence went on and on. Maria's phone rang again. Another call from Tom, no doubt, but she didn't answer. Finally, the double doors of the community center swung open. Tom Whitmore entered, dust and sweat covered. His work shirts were rumpled and streaked with tears. He took in the room with his gaze before spotting mine. Then he came over and, without speaking, dropped to his knees at my feet. "Please," he begged. "I'm begging you. Turn on the water. Those sheep have done nothing wrong. They're dying out there. I'll do anything you want, pay anything you demand, but please don't make them suffer because of what my wife did." The image of that industrious man, on his knees, begging for the lives of animals that were his dependents, was stronger than any lawsuit or threat could ever hope to be. Glaring down at Tom, I felt the icy, empty fury that had propelled me through all the months of harassment begin at last to dissipate. He hadn't done it. His sheep hadn't done it. I reached down and pulled him to his feet. And then I reached for my phone. With one click, the water flow resumed. "Now there is water," I muttered. "Your sheep are okay." Relief washed over Tom's face. He clutched my hand in both of his, tears streaking the grime on his worn cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered roughly. "Thanks for not allowing them to suffer because of her errors." Behind him, Maria appeared to have aged a decade in 1 hour. Her hair clung limply to her face, her makeup smudged in black stripes. The woman once held in absolute power was now little more than a warning sign. I turned to face the room, speaking clearly and firmly. "Now," I said, "let's discuss how we go forward." I proceeded to the front of the community center, Tom by my side. No longer an enemy, so much as an unexpected friend. "Mrs. Whitmore," I started off, meeting her eye, "used fraudulent permits to demolish my property. She threatened me with illegal fines and inspections. And she compromised this whole community's water supply, all to drive me off my land for her profit." I stepped forward so they could all see her plain. "Everyone deserves respect," I went on, "but particularly someone in charge." Maria attempted one final effort to save her reputation. This is all overreaction," she stuttered. "I was merely trying to uphold community standards and preserve everyone's property values." But no one trusted her anymore. Tom addressed his wife, speaking in a low but powerful voice. "Maria," he told her, "you lied to me. You lied to our neighbors. You almost cost me everything I've spent 2 decades building. It's time for you to step aside and take responsibility." In the silence that followed, the HOA board took an emergency vote there in the community center. And it was unanimous. Maria Whitmore's resignation was accepted by all 11 members present on the spot. Tom was asked to remain behind to assist in rebuilding leadership, since it was clear to everyone that he'd been as much a victim as I had. The board also voted to create a fund to restore my garden and recompense me for damages, using the very reserves Maria had intended to invest in her expansion project. Tom turned out to be my nearest neighbor, and ultimately one of my closest friends. He assisted me in replanting each flower, each sapling. He brought sheep manure as a fertilizer and spent long weekends digging beds and pounding fence posts. We found we both liked early morning coffee on the porch, discussing weather and land management while his flock grazed placidly outside the fence. The creek flowed steadily between our lands once again, no longer a weapon, but a reminder of what cooperation could achieve. Maria's retreat from the community was as sudden as her fall. Unable to confront the constant reminders of her shame, she fled in 2 weeks. Tom sought a divorce shortly thereafter, listing irreconcilable differences and basic disagreements about honesty and community responsibility. The last I heard, Maria was employed by a real estate agency in another state, well away from anyone who'd ever remembered how she'd attempted to bulldoze her way toward greater authority. 6 months after that, I was on my rebuilt porch at dawn. The sky was a pinkish gold above the most vibrant-looking garden I ever had. Tom's pickup came chugging down my driveway. He got out with a wheel of cheese wrapped in paper brown, a weekly present from the sheep whose lives I once controlled. "Morning, Travis," he said, settling into the rocking chair I had made for his visits. "Sheep are doing well, creeks are flowing good, and Patricia says the new HOA regulations are doing better than anyone had hoped." I took the cheese, experiencing that same deep, quiet appreciation that I felt each time Tom extended this little act of friendship. "You know," I mentioned, "when I purchased this land, I figured I was simply seeking peace and tranquility. I had no idea that I would become embroiled in a war over wildflowers and water rights." Tom chuckled and took a sip of his coffee. "Sometimes," he explained, "the greatest things in life result from the fights you never wanted to have. Maria believed she could push you around because you were but one man. She didn't remember every system relies on resources, and you held the most important of them all." I smiled, remembering the hidden valve still hidden under my porch, no longer a threat, just a reminder of what counted. "For the first time in my life," Tom murmured, 1,500 sheep were saved by one turn of a valve. Best neighbors I've ever had. We sat quietly together, observing the creek run past my garden out to his grazing land. And in that still moment, I knew that sometimes justice does run like water, slow but irrepressible, running around every block until it gets to exactly where it's supposed to be.